$6,800. That's what my sister Claire announced my rent would be, effective immediately, in front of our entire extended family at Thanksgiving dinner. I'd been paying $2,500 for 3 years. Never late, never complained. Never questioned why my successful marketing executive sister needed my rent money when she owned half the apartment buildings in Brooklyn. Market rate, she said, cutting into her turkey like she was dissecting my financial future. Samantha's been getting a family discount long enough. The room went dead silent. 43 relatives suddenly found their mashed potatoes fascinating. My parents, the people who raised me to believe blood was thicker than greed, shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. My nephew's football game played on the TV in the background, the announcer's voice the only sound cutting through the suffocating quiet as I calculated the numbers that would destroy my life. Current rent, $2,5. New rent, $6,800. Monthly increase, $4,300. My entire take-home pay as a social worker was $4,200 a month. Claire knew exactly what she was doing. This wasn't about market rates or fair housing policies. This was about forcing me out of the neighborhood I'd called home for 6 years, out of the life I'd built, out of the family that apparently valued profit margins more than blood relations. I set down my fork and looked directly at my sister, who was smiling like she'd just announced a promotion instead of my eviction notice. "When do you need my answer?" I asked, my voice steady despite the earthquake happening in my chest. "You don't need to give me an answer," Claire replied, that smirk widening. "You need to give me first month's rent by December 1st. That's how leases work." That night, lying awake in the studio apartment that would soon cost more than most people's mortgages, I made 3 promises to myself. I would not beg, I would not break, and I would make sure that one day, Claire would regret teaching me exactly how ruthless family could be. My name is Samantha Allen. I'm 32 years old now, but this story starts 6 years ago when I was 26, and stupid enough to believe that family meant safety, that blood meant belonging, and that paying rent to your parents was partnership instead of preparation for betrayal. Picture this: a red brick duplex in Park Slope, Brooklyn, the kind of property that looks modest from the outside but carries a mortgage payment that could fund a small country's defense budget. My parents bought it in 1987 for $89,000. By 2018, when I moved into the converted basement studio, Zillow estimated it at $2.3 million. I should have seen the writing on the wall when they started calling it an investment property instead of the family home. But I was 26, fresh out of my master's in social work program, drowning in student debt that made my monthly loan payments feel like a second mortgage, and desperate to stay in the neighborhood where I'd built my adult life. When Mom suggested I rent the basement studio for $2,500 a month, below market rate, she assured me, a family discount, it felt like salvation wrapped in motherly love. "This way you can save money, and we can keep the family close," Dad said, standing in the doorway of what would become my home for the next 6 years. His voice carried that tone of benevolent authority that had defined every major decision in our household since I'd learned to walk. The studio was 400 square feet of converted basement space, with a kitchenette that consisted of a mini fridge, a 2-burner stovetop, and cabinet space, measured in inches rather than feet. The ceiling was so low that anyone over 5'8" had to duck walking through the doorway. The single window faced a brick wall 3 feet away, filtering what little sunlight made it through like it was being rationed. But it was mine. Or at least, I thought it was. The routine became my religion. First of every month, I'd climb the narrow stairs from my basement apartment to the main house, where Mom would be waiting at the kitchen counter with her receipts book and reading glasses. I'd hand over my rent check, $2,500 made out to Claire Allen Properties LLC, and she'd write me a receipt in her careful, cursive, the same handwriting that had signed my school permission slips and birthday cards. "Claire handles all the business side," Mom would explain, as if my 28-year-old sister's recently acquired real estate license made her qualified to manage a multi-million-dollar property portfolio. "She's so good with numbers." Good with numbers. That should have been my first warning. But I didn't just pay rent. I became the building's unofficial maintenance crew, property manager, and all-around problem solver. Upstairs toilet clogged? Samantha will fix it. Gutters need cleaning? Samantha has a ladder. Basement floods during heavy rain? Samantha's the one with the wet-dry vacuum and no other place to go. I painted walls, fixed leaky faucets, scraped ice off sidewalks in January, mowed the postage stamp backyard every 2 weeks from April through October. I hauled garbage cans to the curb on Tuesday nights and dragged them back every Wednesday morning before work. I signed for packages, dealt with utility companies, and once spent an entire Saturday installing a new ceiling fan in my parents' bedroom because hiring a handyman would have cost $200. "You're so handy," Mom would say, watching me wrestle with electrical wiring while balanced on a stepladder. Claire could never do this kind of work. Claire could never do this kind of work because Claire was busy building her real estate empire on other people's labor. While I was up to my elbows in plumbing repairs and paint fumes, she was closing deals on investment properties throughout Brooklyn and Queens, leveraging our family duplex as collateral for bigger and bigger acquisitions. The warning signs were everywhere, but I interpreted them as family quirks instead of business strategy. Like the brunch in Williamsburg, spring of 2021, when Claire showed up wearing a Chanel bag that cost more than 3 months of my rent. She was telling some story about a problem tenant who was behind on payments, gesturing with manicured nails that probably cost more than my monthly Metro card. "The thing people don't understand about real estate," she said, cutting into Eggs Benedict that cost $47, "is that it's not personal. It's business. You can't let emotions cloud your judgment when it comes to maximizing property value." I was picking at a $12 avocado toast, the cheapest thing on the menu, wondering how my sister had developed such strong opinions about real estate management when her biggest responsibility growing up had been remembering to feed her goldfish. "But Sam, you're different," she continued, her voice taking on that patronizing tone she'd perfected in high school when explaining why she couldn't share clothes with me. "You're basically the tenant. I'm the landlord. That's just business." Mom laughed it off. "Don't take her so seriously, Samantha. You know how Claire gets when she's in business mode." Business mode. As if exploitation was just another personality trait, like being introverted or having a sweet tooth. That comment lodged in my chest like a splinter, but I pushed it down. Claire was just being Claire, dramatic, self-important, convinced that owning 3 rental properties made her Donald Trump in designer shoes. She didn't mean anything by it. Except she did. The family dynamic had crystallized over the years into roles we all played without acknowledging the script. Dad, the enforcer whose word was law and whose approval required constant earning. Mom, the mediator who smoothed over conflicts by pretending they didn't exist. Claire, the golden child whose mistakes were reframed as learning experiences and whose successes were celebrated like national holidays. And me, the glue holding everything together, the one who could be counted on to sacrifice her own comfort for everyone else's convenience. The daughter whose reliability was so absolute it had become invisible. Every family gathering followed the same pattern. Claire would arrive late, full of stories about her latest real estate deal or expensive vacation. She'd hold court at the dinner table, regaling everyone with tales of tenant negotiations and property management challenges, while I served the meal I'd helped Mom prepare and would later help her clean up. "Samantha's so steady," relatives would say. Like steadiness was consolation prize for not being remarkable. You always know she'll be there when you need her. Steady, reliable, responsible. The family words for the one who pays the bills and fixes the problems while everyone else gets credit for being interesting. I thought I was investing in family harmony, building equity in relationships that would matter when life got hard. I thought paying rent below market rate was generous on their part and responsible on mine. I thought the maintenance work and property management were expressions of love, ways to contribute beyond just writing monthly checks. What I didn't understand was that every repair I made, every problem I solved, every month I paid rent without complaint was just adding value to an asset I'd never own. I wasn't building equity in family relationships. I was building equity in Claire's real estate portfolio. I was the tenant who improved the property. She was the landlord collecting rent on my improvements. And when property values rose high enough, when my below-market rent started looking like money left on the table, when keeping me around became less profitable than forcing me out, that's when I'd learned the difference between being family and being business. The $2,500 I paid every month wasn't just rent. It was tuition in a class I didn't know I was taking, learning a lesson I'd never wanted to learn, that some people will accept your love, your labor, and your loyalty for years, all while calculating the exact moment when betraying you becomes more profitable than protecting you. November 25th, 2021. Thanksgiving dinner at my parents' house, the same dining room where I'd celebrated every major milestone of my life, where birthday candles had been blown out and report cards had been praised, and college acceptance letters had been opened with trembling hands. 43 relatives crammed around tables that groaned under the weight of Mom's legendary spread, 2 20-pound turkeys, stuffing that took her 3 days to perfect, sweet potato casserole with the marshmallows golden brown exactly the way Grandma used to make it. The house smelled like butter and sage and the kind of family warmth that Norman Rockwell built his career painting. I was in the kitchen helping Mom plate the cranberry sauce when Claire's voice cut through the comfortable chatter from the dining room. Before we dig in, I have an announcement to make. My stomach dropped before my brain processed why. Something in her tone, too bright, too practiced, the voice of someone who'd rehearsed words they knew would detonate lives. I walked into the dining room carrying the gravy boat, weaving between cousins and uncles and the folding chairs we'd dragged up from the basement to accommodate everyone. Claire stood at the head of the table, wine glass raised like she was about to toast someone's engagement or promotion. As many of you know, I've been managing our family's investment properties for the past few years, she began, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd confused a real estate license with an MBA from Wharton. Investment properties, plural, as if the duplex where I lived and paid rent had somehow multiplied overnight. And with the market being what it is, property values in Park Slope have increased 47% since 2018. I've had to make some adjustments to bring our rental rates in line with current market conditions. Market conditions. She was talking about my home like it was a stock portfolio that needed rebalancing. So starting January 1st, Samantha's rent will be adjusted from $2,500 to $6,800 per month. The words hit the room like a physical force. Conversations died mid-sentence. Forks froze halfway to mouths. My cousin Jenny choked on her wine and started coughing, the sound harsh and desperate in the sudden silence. $6,800 per month for a 400 square foot basement studio with a ceiling so low it violated modern building codes. I set the gravy boat down on the sideboard because my hands were shaking too violently to trust myself with hot liquid near other people. The numbers ricocheted around my skull like bullets. Current rent $2,500, new rent $6,800, difference $4,300. My entire monthly take-home pay as a social worker was $4,200. Claire was smiling at me expectantly, like she'd just announced a pleasant surprise instead of my financial execution. That's quite an increase, Uncle Robert said carefully. The way people speak when they're trying not to ignite a bomb they've just discovered in their living room. Market rate, Claire replied with a shrug that cost more than most people's car payments. Her Hermes scarf alone was worth 2 months of my old rent. Comparable units in the neighborhood are renting for $6,500 to $7,500. Samantha's been getting a family discount for years. It's time she pays what the space is actually worth. Family discount. 6 years of maintaining their property, of being available for every emergency repair and tenant crisis, of treating their investment like my home instead of their business, reduced to a discount they were graciously revoking. The silence stretched like a taut wire ready to snap. I could feel 43 pairs of eyes turning toward me, waiting for my reaction. Some faces showed shock. Others carried the uncomfortable expression of people watching a car accident they couldn't prevent. Then Dad cleared his throat, that authoritative rumble that had ended arguments and settled disputes throughout my entire childhood. Claire's right, he said, his voice carrying the weight of paternal judgment. It's only fair. Business is business, and family members can't expect special treatment forever. Mom nodded in agreement, her eyes fixed on her plate like the pattern of Mom's china had suddenly become fascinating. The market has changed so much. We have to be realistic about property values. Fair. They called it fair to price me out of my home with 4 weeks' notice during the holiday season, to demand rent that exceeded my entire salary, to treat their daughter like a stranger whose lease had expired. My throat felt like it was closing, but I managed to force out the only question that mattered. When do you need an answer? Claire's smile widened, the expression of a predator who'd just cornered prey. Oh, you don't need to give me an answer, Sam. You need to give me first month's rent by December 15th. That's how leases work. The conversation gradually resumed around me, stilted at first, then gaining momentum as people realized the show was over. But I sat frozen in my chair, calculating and recalculating numbers that all led to the same impossible conclusion. I couldn't afford it, not even close. Not even if I stopped eating, canceled my phone plan, sold every possession I owned, and worked a second job 7 days a week. The math was simple, brutal, and absolute. They were evicting me and calling it business. That's when the real knife twisted. This wasn't about market rates or property values or any of the financial justifications Claire had wrapped around her decision like gift paper on a bomb. This was about power. About putting me in my place, reminding me that I was tenant first, daughter second. About teaching me that the 6 years of love, labor, and loyalty I'd invested in their property meant nothing when set against the promise of an extra $51,000 in annual rental income. I forced myself to eat the rest of dinner, choking down turkey that tasted like sawdust and sweet potatoes that might as well have been sand. Every bite felt like swallowing my own humiliation, but I refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing me break. Later that night, alone in my basement studio that would soon belong to someone else, I sat on my bed and stared at the water stain on the ceiling I'd been meaning to fix. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd spent 6 years maintaining a property that was being used to destroy me. Shame tastes metallic, like pennies dissolving on your tongue. It settles in your stomach like lead and makes every breath feel like you're drowning in air. That night, I learned that family betrayal doesn't announce itself with dramatic music and emotional speeches. It arrives with spreadsheets and market analysis, wrapped in business terminology that makes exploitation sound like economics. They'd taught me the most valuable lesson of my adult life, that love without boundaries becomes permission for people to destroy you, and that blood relation is no protection against calculated cruelty. The rent increase wasn't about money. It was about showing me exactly where I stood in their hierarchy of importance, and I just learned I ranked somewhere below profit margins and tax depreciation. December 15th came and went without a $6,800 rent check. December 20th brought the eviction notice, delivered by certified mail in an envelope that felt heavier than it should have, considering it contained just 3 pages of legal language that boiled down to one simple message: get out. 30 days. That's all the notice New York State required for month-to-month tenants who'd been living somewhere for 6 years, who'd treated the landlord's property like their own, who'd foolishly believed that family meant something more than a business relationship with shared DNA. Moving day arrived on the kind of bitter January morning that makes you question every life choice that led you to live somewhere with actual winter. My 2014 Honda Civic, bought used with money I'd saved by living in my parents' basement and maintaining their property for free, was packed to the ceiling with everything I owned. 6 years of adult life reduced to boxes labeled in black Sharpie: books, kitchen stuff, winter clothes. The things that had made that basement studio feel like home now looked pathetic and sparse, like evidence of a life that had never quite gotten started. I drove away from Park Slope for the last time, watching the red brick duplex shrink in my rearview mirror until it disappeared behind a city bus that probably cost more per month to operate than my old rent. The neighborhood I'd called home for my entire adult life became just another collection of overpriced brownstones where I could no longer afford to exist. The new apartment was in Sunset Park, a one-room studio above Wang's Wash and Fold, where the smell of industrial detergent mixed with something that might have been mold or might have been despair, creating an aroma that settled into your clothes and followed you everywhere like a cologne made of failure. 450 square feet for $1,800 a month. Still more than I wanted to pay, but the only place I could find that would accept someone with decent credit and no cosigner. The walls were painted institutional beige, the kind of color chosen specifically because it shows dirt but doesn't inspire hope. The single window faced a brick wall 18 inches away, filtering what little sunlight made it through like it was being rationed by committee. The neighbors provided a constant soundtrack of other people's disasters: screaming matches that lasted until 3 a.m., babies crying through paper, thin walls, the upstairs tenant who apparently practiced flamenco dancing at midnight every Tuesday. The building's heating system worked sporadically, controlled by a thermostat in the landlord's apartment that he kept set to Arctic tundra to save money on gas bills. I furnished the place with whatever I could afford from Facebook Marketplace and garage sales. A futon that folded into something resembling a couch during the day. A card table that served as both desk and dining room. A mini fridge that hummed so loudly, it sounded like it was slowly dying of mechanical emphysema. Dinner became an exercise in creative poverty. Instant ramen with an egg cracked into it if I was feeling fancy, peanut butter sandwiches if I wasn't, and sometimes just sleeping through mealtimes because hunger is easier to ignore when you're unconscious. I learned that generic mac and cheese costs 79 cents a box and contains enough sodium to pickle a small mammal. But it would keep you alive when your bank account balance looked like a phone number for a very small town. The freelance work came in desperate spurts: grant writing for nonprofits, social media consulting for small businesses, anything that paid money and didn't require me to explain why a 32-year-old social worker was suddenly homeless and seeking part-time employment. I'd apply for jobs on my laptop balanced on that wobbly card table, trying to sound professional, while my upstairs neighbor practiced what sounded like competitive furniture moving. 3 a.m. became my most honest hour, when the laundromat below was finally quiet and the city settled into that brief pause between late-night desperation and early-morning ambition. I'd lie on my futon couch-bed hybrid, scrolling through banking apps that showed numbers I didn't want to see, watching my savings account drain like blood from an open wound. 4847美元 3203美元 1856美元 742美元 Each month brought me closer to a mathematical certainty I didn't want to calculate, the exact date when my money would run out and I'd have to choose between rent and food, between having a roof and having hope. The worst part wasn't the financial stress or the constant smell of fabric softener, or even the loneliness that settled over everything like dust on furniture you never use. The worst part was the voice in my head that sounded suspiciously like Claire, whispering that maybe they were right. Maybe I was ungrateful. Maybe expecting family loyalty was naive. Maybe I deserved exactly what I'd gotten. That voice was loudest during the crying jags that came without warning, in grocery store checkout lines when I had to put back items I couldn't afford, on subway platforms when I saw apartments I'd never be able to rent, in the shower of my tiny bathroom where the water pressure was so weak it felt like being cried on by a depressed cloud. But somewhere between the third month of instant noodles and the 15th rejection email for jobs I was overqualified for, something shifted. The voice in my head that sounded like surrender got quieter, replaced by something harder and cleaner. They called it fair. They called me ungrateful for refusing to pay $6,800 for a basement studio that violated fire codes. They called it business when they priced their own daughter out of housing during a pandemic. But fairness isn't theirs to define, my worth isn't theirs to erase, and gratitude isn't something you owe people for the privilege of being exploited by them. Desperation is lonely, but it sharpens you like steel dragged across stone. Every night I couldn't afford heat. Every meal that came from a box marked 99 cents. Every morning I woke up in a room that smelled like other people's laundry. It was all fuel for something that was growing inside me. The folding table at Wang's Wash and Fold became my command center. Every night, after my day job at the community mental health clinic, I'd claim the corner spot next to the industrial dryers, set up my laptop between piles of other people's laundry, and build something they'd never seen coming. The smell of fabric softener and determination became my office atmosphere. The rhythmic thumping of washing machines provided the soundtrack to 18-hour days, fueled by gas station coffee that tasted like liquid ambition mixed with artificial vanilla flavoring. My first client was a small nonprofit that needed grant proposals written but couldn't afford the big consulting firms charging $5,000 for work. I could do better in half the time. $50 an hour, more than I'd ever charged for anything in my life, but less than what my expertise was worth. That first check for $847 felt like winning the lottery. I took a photo before depositing it. The paper crinkled from being carried in my wallet like a talisman, proving that maybe, just maybe, I could build something from nothing. Word traveled fast in Brooklyn's nonprofit circles. One satisfied client led to 3 referrals. 3 referrals became 10 projects. 10 projects turned into enough income to upgrade from instant ramen to actual groceries that didn't come in boxes marked 99 cents. By month 6, I was making more from freelance grant writing than my full-time social work salary. By month 9, I'd quit the clinic and was working exclusively for myself, hunched over that folding table like it was a mahogany desk in a corner office. The breakthrough came at 2:17 a.m. on a Tuesday in October 2022. I'd been working on a proposal for a healthcare startup that was trying to revolutionize mental health services in underserved communities, exactly the kind of work that made me remember why I'd gotten into social work in the first place, before family betrayal had taught me that helping others starts with helping yourself. The email notification chimed through the laundromat's silence. Proposal accepted, $127,000 contract awarded. I read it 3 times before the numbers registered. $127,000. For 6 months of work that I loved, that mattered, that would actually improve people's lives instead of just pushing paperwork around government offices. I printed that contract on the laundromat's coin-operated printer, 25 cents per page for 17 pages of legal language that added up to more money than I'd ever seen in my life. The paper was still warm when I held it against the fluorescent lights, checking to make sure the numbers were real. That night, I allowed myself to dream bigger than survival. The sticky notes started appearing on my cracked walls like yellow squares of possibility. First office space by February. Hire assistant by summer. 6-figure year by December. Each goal written in black Sharpie, each target a stepping stone toward something I was afraid to name out loud. Success on my own terms. The office search began in December. 1,500 square feet in Gowanus, with actual windows that opened, actual heat that worked, actual walls that didn't smell like other people's fabric softener. The rent was $4,200 a month, more than my entire take-home pay used to be, but now just a line item in a budget that included things like equipment, marketing, and employee salaries. Moving day felt like resurrection. Box by box, I transported my life from the room above the laundromat to a space with my name on the lease, my business license on the wall, my future spread out in square footage I could actually afford. The ribbon-cutting ceremony was just me, a pair of office scissors from Staples, and a piece of red ribbon I'd bought from the party store for $1.99. But standing in that doorway, looking at desks arranged in rows and a conference table that didn't wobble, I felt something I'd forgotten existed, pride without apology. My first employee was Jessica, a recent MSW graduate who reminded me of myself 6 years earlier, bright, determined, and convinced that hard work would be rewarded with loyalty. I paid her $28 an hour to start, with health insurance and 2 weeks paid vacation, because I remembered what it felt like to choose between rent and medical care. "Why nonprofit consulting?" she asked during her first week, surrounded by grant applications and funding proposals that would keep community programs running for another year. "Because," I said, looking out our windows at the Brooklyn skyline where I'd rebuilt my life one client at a time, sometimes the people who need help the most are the ones trying to help everyone else. By year 2, we had 7 employees and contracts worth over $500,000. By year 3, we'd helped secure $12 million in funding for programs serving homeless youth, immigrant families, and survivors of domestic violence, people who understood what it meant to start over from nothing. The framed check from that first big contract hung on my office wall where I used to keep overdue bills. Not as a trophy, but as a reminder of the moment I stopped believing their definition of my worth and started writing my own. Success wasn't about revenge, though I won't lie. There was satisfaction in knowing that while I was building something meaningful, Claire was probably dealing with the headaches of actually being a landlord. Tenant complaints, maintenance requests, the endless paperwork that comes with owning property instead of just inheriting it. But the real victory was simpler and deeper than anything they could understand. I'd learned the difference between being needed and being valued, between surviving and thriving, between accepting other people's limits and setting my own standards. The word fair had been weaponized against me, used to justify exploitation and dress up cruelty as business sense. But fairness isn't something other people get to define for you. It's not a market rate, or a family obligation, or a lesson about gratitude. Fairness is building something that belongs entirely to you, where your worth isn't measured by how much you'll sacrifice but by how much value you can create. It's the difference between paying $6,800 rent to someone who sees you as disposable and signing checks for employees who see you as essential. They'd taught me what I was worth to them. I'd spent 3 years teaching myself what I was worth to me. The student had become the teacher, and class was just getting started. 3 years. That's how long it took for the phone call to come. Not from Claire, who was apparently too proud to dial my number directly, but from Mom. her voice carrying that familiar tone of forced casualness that preceded family emergencies. "Samantha, honey, we're having Uncle Robert's retirement party next Saturday at the Elks Lodge. We'd love for you to come. It's been too long since we've all been together." All been together. Like we were estranged cousins who'd lost touch over geography, instead of a daughter who'd been financially exiled by her own family's greed. The whispers I caught throughout the evening painted a picture of systematic failure: 3 foreclosures, 2 tenant lawsuits, and 1 IRS audit that had apparently been ongoing since last spring. The golden child who'd inherited success had learned the hard way that maintaining it required competence she'd never bothered to develop. Mom approached me during the salad course, her movements carrying the careful precision of someone navigating a minefield of their own creation. "Samantha, you look wonderful, successful." She paused, searching for words that wouldn't sound like the request they obviously were. "We've heard about your business. 7 employees now? That's incredible." 11 employees, actually, and a waiting list of clients that stretched 3 months out. But I didn't correct her. The conversation wasn't about my success. It was about their need for it. "Business has been good," I replied, cutting into lettuce that probably cost less per pound than my hourly rate. "Claire's had some challenges lately. The real estate market, you know. It's been tough for everyone in property management." Mom's voice carried the same tone she'd used when explaining why Christmas presents would be lighter some years, why Dad's gambling debts meant we couldn't afford school trips, why family loyalty required individual sacrifice. Challenges. The same word they'd used to describe a fender bender when referring to a 5-car pileup caused by drunk driving. Dad materialized beside Mom like they'd planned this intervention, his face wearing the expression of someone who'd run out of options except the one they'd dismissed 3 years earlier. "We know things ended badly between you and Claire," he said, not quite meeting my eyes. "But family is family. Maybe there's a way you could help. Your business, her experience with real estate, a partnership of some kind." A partnership. Between the sister who'd tripled my rent with 4 weeks' notice and the woman who'd spent 3 years building something from the ashes of that betrayal, I set down my fork and reached into my purse. Italian leather now, a far cry from the canvas bag I'd carried when I was counting dollars for grocery money. The contract was folded neatly inside, a letter of intent from a healthcare conglomerate that wanted to expand our consulting services nationally. I placed it on the table between us, the letterhead catching light from the overhead fixtures like evidence in a trial where I was finally allowed to be both prosecutor and judge. $2 million in annual revenue, I said, my voice steady as bedrock. That's what my company generated last year. This contract would double it. Their eyes widened as they processed numbers that exceeded anything Claire had ever accomplished, anything they'd imagined I was capable of, anything that fit their understanding of who I was supposed to be in the family hierarchy. "You called it fair when Claire raised my rent from $2,500 to $6,800, I continued, folding the contract and slipping it back into my purse. "You said business was business, that family members couldn't expect special treatment forever." The silence that followed was different from the Thanksgiving dinner 3 years earlier. This wasn't the quiet of people watching someone else's humiliation. This was the silence of people realizing they'd misjudged everything about the person sitting across from them. "I learned that lesson well," I said, standing up and smoothing my dress, charcoal gray wool that cost more than 3 months of my old rent. "So here's what's fair now. I don't owe you anything. Not my money, not my connections, not my forgiveness for teaching me that family loyalty is a one-way street." I looked directly at Claire for the first time that evening. She was staring into her wine glass like it contained answers to questions she was afraid to ask out loud. The smirk that had defined our relationship for 32 years was nowhere to be found, replaced by something that might have been recognition or might have been regret. "You wanted to teach me about market rates and business decisions," I said, my words carrying across the room with the authority of someone who'd learned to value herself in currencies they'd never understand. "Congratulations. I graduated with honors." I walked toward the exit, my heels clicking against linoleum floors that had witnessed decades of family celebrations, holiday gatherings, milestone moments that now felt like scenes from someone else's life. Behind me, I could hear the whispers starting, relatives processing what they'd just witnessed, trying to reconcile the dutiful daughter they remembered with the woman who'd just delivered a masterclass in consequences. At the door, I heard the sound of glass hitting floor, followed by Mom's sharp intake of breath. I didn't turn around, but I could picture it. Claire's wine glass tipped over, red liquid spreading across white plastic tablecloth like blood from a wound that wouldn't heal. Some stains can't be cleaned up with club soda and good intentions. Walking to my car in the parking lot where I'd once loaded boxes of everything I owned into a Honda Civic that barely ran, I felt something I'd spent 3 years building toward. Complete and total freedom from needing their approval, their acceptance, or their understanding of my worth. They'd raised my rent from $2,500 to $6,800 and called it fair. Life had spent 3 years proving what truly fair looked like, and it had nothing to do with market rates or family obligations. It looked like building something they could never steal, never devalue, never take away. Something that was finally, completely, unshakably mine. If Samantha's story made your blood boil, if you've ever been financially exploited by family members who called it business, if you've ever had to choose between accepting abuse and losing your home, you understand why this story needed to be told. Smash that like button if you've ever been the family member expected to sacrifice while everyone else prospered. Subscribe and hit the notification bell because next week we're sharing Maria's story, a woman who supported her husband through law school for 7 years, only to get served divorce papers the day after he made partner. Her comeback will restore your faith in karma. Drop a comment below. Have you ever been financially exploited by family? What was your breaking point? Share your story because every time someone speaks up about toxic family financial dynamics, it gives someone else permission to set boundaries instead of setting themselves on fire. Remember what Samantha learned. Fair isn't what other people define for you. Fair is building something that belongs entirely to you, where your worth isn't measured by how much you'll sacrifice but by how much value you can create. Build something they can't steal. Build something they can't devalue. Build something that's yours.